20 minutes.
20 minutes. And I'm asked to put Zen and the tea ceremony in historical context for you. Those are two vast subjects. And it would take a lot longer than 20 minutes to talk about just one of them, especially Zen. So we can only skim the surface. But I'll do my best, and I hope that I don't tell you just things which are entirely well known to. I should say, though, that though I've been messing around with things Japanese for many, many years, I look at such things as Zen and the tea ceremony from the outside. I'm not a practitioner of either, but I've necessarily had to learn quite a bit about them from a historical point of view in relation to visual art in particular. So my standpoint is what some writers describe as eating as opposed to eaming, you know those terms. Anyway, first of all, Zen. The Japanese word Zen is a contraction of Zen-na, which transliterates the Sanskrit word dhyana, meaning meditation. The Zen schools of Buddhism are therefore literally the meditation schools, because they particularly emphasize meditation. There are three national versions of Zen. We have Chinese Chan, Korean Son, and Japanese Zen, all written with the same Chinese character. The early history of Chinese Chan is somewhat confused, and there's a problem of distinguishing between the northern and southern schools of Chinese Buddhism, Chinese Chan, and of discounting the many legends associated with it. In general, Chan taught sudden versus gradual awakening. Awakening is the term I prefer to enlightenment. It's a slightly different metaphor, but it more accurately translates the Sanskrit term bodhi, which literally means awakening. And the Japanese word satori, which is used in Zen context particularly, also means awakening. So Chan taught sudden versus gradual awakening, and it took ideas from Indian Madhyamika Buddhism, Buddhist philosophy. There was not a distinct equivalent of Chan, though, in Indian philosophy. In China, Chan began to develop in around 400 AD with the teachings of two rather obscure monks. I won't bother you with their names, but one of them emphasized that he thought sudden awakening was more appropriate for Chinese Buddhists than gradual awakening. Gradual awakening being something that is achieved over many lifetimes and not in a hurry. This was a long-standing dispute in both Chinese and Tibetan Buddhism over many years. Another figure particularly associated with the rise of Chan in China is Bodhidharma, who is said to have come from South India at the beginning of the 6th century, but he's largely a figure of legend. He's known as the first patriarch of Chan, and his disciple, Huiko, was the second patriarch. Japanese scholars like to distinguish between Bodhidharma, a historical figure, and Dharma, the legendary figure. Dharma being a figure very important in later Japanese folklore, one of the 7 gods of good luck. Quite different from the figure of Bodhidharma. However, Bodhidharma himself is mostly legend, and there probably was such a person, but that's as far as one can go. The problem arises partly because the rival schools of Buddhism in China and rival schools of Chan were all making claims for themselves. manufacturing genealogies and falsifying history. The Chan school in China arose as a distinct school only in the 9th century, quite a bit later, in other words, 500 years later than the beginnings of Chan itself. And the term Chan originally denoted the whole of Buddhism, not one particular school. There was a strong influence in China on Chan of Tian-type Buddhism. That's from Mount Tian-type. That's the equivalent of that in Japan is Tendai school of Buddhism. I should say that Chan and Zen are not mainstream Buddhism, neither China or Japan. Mainstream Buddhism is rather Tiantai or Shingon Buddhism, Tendai Buddhism and Shingon Buddhism in Japan. There are many kinds of meditation in the Buddhist tradition, from India to China to Japan. The Chan developed its own mythology, and texts which you see in collections of Chan anecdotes going back to the 11th century. The Chan school, as it developed in the 9th century, abolished Buddhas, Bodhisattvas, sutras, and Abhidhamma, the commentaries on texts. And it substituted Chinese monks, except for Bodhidharma himself, who was supposed to be Indian. And it used mottos, four-character mottos, and truth conveyed outside the sutras from heart to heart. So direct transmission was the idea. There are also collections of remarks which were made by Chinese monks and published. Though Chan tried to get on without using text, in the end it developed a vast repertory of texts. In the Rinzai school of Japanese Zen and in Korean Son Buddhism, there was much use of little logical problems, the so-called koan in Japanese. There are collections of those and answer books compiled. Professor Victor Hori at Yale University, who was one of Ashley's teachers, told me, has studied one such text from the 17th century and written a vast commentary on it. I recommend, if you want to know about that, looking at his great book called Zen Sand. In China, too, they developed separate rules for the monkish order, the Vinaya, which replaced the Indian rules for the Buddhist community, the Vinaya. In China, then, there was a distinction between northern and southern schools, as I mentioned. But the two of the main southern schools came to be influential in Japan. Those were the Taogung, Japanese Soto, and Linji, Japanese Rinzai schools. The first transmission of Chan to Japan occurred in the 9th century when a monk of the Linji school came to the court at the invitation of the empress. He later returned to China, and that was that. Zen did not take root in Japan at that time. But then in the late 12th century, a Japanese monk called Eisai, sometimes his name is written as Yosai, and who had trained in the Tendai school on Mount Hiei, went twice to Japan, came back, and he founded the first Zen monastery in Japan, in Kyushu, in 1191. And he got protection from the Minamoto shogun. He you've all heard of the shoguns. There were three different lineages of shoguns in Japanese history. There were the Minamoto shoguns in the 12th, 13th centuries, earlier 14th century. Then there were the Ashikaga shoguns in the 15th century. Then finally the Tokugawa shoguns. And they all had headquarters in different places. The Minamoto shoguns were based in Kamakura, the Ashikaga shoguns in Kyoto, which is the old capital, and then the Tokugawa shoguns much later in Edo, now Tokyo. At the time which we're speaking, Tokyo didn't exist, and Edo was just a tiny little village. Anyway, back to Eisai. He got protection from one of the Minamoto shoguns, who made him head of Kenninji in Kyoto, and he introduced this Ninji transmission, as well as the use of matcha, powdered tea. He wrote a little book about it, in fact, on his Hisayo Joki, which deals with mulberries in one section and tea in another part. But he recommended matcha for its medicinal qualities rather than for any spiritual gain you might get from it. The other main transmission of Zen Buddhism was due to a Japanese monk called Dogen, who similarly studied in China. He lived in the 13th century. He was a pupil originally of Eisai. And after his return from China, he founded Eiheiji in the wilds of western Japan, in Echizen province, in 1278. These two transmissions of Zen developed in Japan. The Rinzai, one based on Chinese Linji Buddhism, and the Soto tradition based on Taodong. The Rinzai tradition is the better known one outside Japan as well as in Japan itself. There's a large concentration of Rinzai Zen monasteries, particularly in Kyoto, which were founded with imperial or shogunal patronage, and it's in connection. It's there above all that the tea ceremony took root. The Soto tradition is more scattered. Soto monasteries tend to be in remote country districts, starting with Eiheiji itself, and their approach to enlightenment is somewhat different than that of the Rinzai people. They're both looking for satori and for a sudden awakening, but their approach to achieving it is different. In the Rinzai tradition, you actively strive to attain it. In the Soto tradition, you just sit around and wait for it to happen.